Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little reckless. We're going to walk right up to a well-dressed Victorian woman. One of those stately, corseted types with a steely stare and a hat larger than most Victorian apartments, and ask her, very politely, how she did her hair. Yes, really. You're going to stand there and ask as if you've got no idea what kind of serpentine chaos you're about to awaken. A simple question, right? And yet, you probably won't survive this. Picture the towering hair before you, part sculpture, part battleground, part bird's nest. It rises like a tiered sponge cake from her head, gleaming faintly under a layer of powder that smells vaguely of lavender and boiled mutton. You can practically hear it creak. And beneath that proud dome lies a history of flaming hot, curling irons, animal fat concoctions, and hairpins capable of impaling small rodents. But that's a story for later. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've caught her attention. She turns her head slowly, a movement so rehearsed and delicate that it seems choreographed. Her hair does not move. That's your first warning. A gentle breeze ruffles her skirts, but not a single curl dares flutter. You swallow. It begins with a look. Not hostile, but not warm either. More like someone appraising a child who's just asked if dragons are real. "My hair," she says, voice clipped. "You wish to know how this was achieved?" You nod. You brave fool. She tilts her head slightly, again, with the eerie control of someone who has practiced for years to ensure that no sudden movements unhinge the scaffolding upon which her entire persona rests. "Very well," she says. "Let us begin at the beginning. Wash day." You're not quite sure when the conversation stops being hypothetical. Her words swirl like the scent of rose water and soap, except not too much soap and definitely not too much water. That would be wasteful and dangerous. "You must understand," she begins, leading you to an imaginary dressing table, "that Victorian hair is not simply done. It is cultivated, maintained, preserved. It is not a routine. It is a vocation. A badge of discipline. A warning." She lifts a gloved hand, pointing to her own head. This took 4 hours this morning, and that's on a good day." You blink. 4 hours? She smiles. It's not reassuring. "First the brushing," she says. 100 strokes. Minimum. With a proper bristle brush. Boar, ideally. Natural oils, you see. If one's maid is competent and strong of wrist, it only takes 30 minutes. That's before pins. Before braids, before the false hair. Wait, false hair? She waves a hand dismissively. "We'll get to that." She leans slightly closer. Her perfume is complex, roses, starch, and just a hint of ammonia. But what you must first grasp is this. You never ask a Victorian woman about her hair unless you are ready to know the truth. Not the charming bits in novels, the real stuff, the rat nests, the lice combs, the melted wax disasters, and the very real, very sharp hairpins that may or may not be concealed in one's bun. You feel like you've opened a dusty door in an old manor house and found a room full of angry raccoons in ball gowns. There's no going back. And let us be clear, she adds, I don't do this for amusement. I do it for social survival. My hair tells the world I am clean, controlled. Modest, wealthy. The higher the bun, the closer to God. Or at least, closer to being taken seriously at the garden party. You catch yourself wondering how many birds might be nesting up there. She continues unfazed. And on a windy day, well, that's when you discover whether your pins were truly anchored, or if today is the day your entire head topples into someone's soup. It has happened. Ask Lady Forrester. Actually, don't. She's still terribly sensitive about the consommé incident. You try to imagine what your own hair would look like after 4 hours of starching, brushing, braiding, oiling, teasing, and wiring. A mess, most likely. A very tired, defeated mess. But she's still going. Her tone shifts, softening just a touch. Of course, there are some days it's not so bad. When the fog rolls in and you know no one will see you clearly, on those days you simply tie a scarf around it all and claim you've taken up foreign fashion. You nod. You understand now that her hair is not just hair. It is a resume. A resume stapled to her skull with tiny brass weapons. And tomorrow, she says, brushing an invisible fleck of powder from your sleeve. We do it all again. You thought you were prepared. You'd heard the jokes. Victorians washed once a year, used chamber pots, and thought leeches were a wellness routine. But what you weren't ready for was the wash day monologue. Because when she says wash day, what she really means is rare, sacred occasion involving existential dread, towels the size of small blankets, and a complicated system of boiling kettles and prayer. She glances toward the window, as if trying to remember the last time she washed her hair. 3 weeks ago, I believe, she says calmly, while straightening her already immobile posture. Though that's a bit frequent, really. We usually go 6, unless there's rain or mildew. Or, heaven forbid, the maid gets distracted and burns the soap again. You raise a brow. 6 weeks? Of course, she adds, as if you should have known. You must understand. It's not as if we're rolling in shampoo like some kind of modern bathing heiress. Water is heated by hand. Soap is hand-rendered, often with suet or lye. And a full rinse takes nearly an hour. By the end, you smell like boiled lamb and despair. The mainstream historical fact here is that Victorian women genuinely did avoid frequent hair washing. In part, yes, because of access to clean water, but also because of what happened to your scalp when you doused it in the aggressive soaps of the day. Think of a mixture that could strip paint and then add rose oil, so you think it's fancy. Washing, she continues, is something one must prepare for emotionally. First, you must decide to do it. This alone can take days. You can relate. Then you gather your team, your maid, a footman to carry kettles, sometimes even a neighbor with strong wrists. You see, hair is rinsed with a pitcher, not a tap. You sit on a stool. You hunch. You pray you don't tip the basin, and when it's done, your neck will be sore, your towel soaked, and your hair, it will be wet for approximately 18 hours. That's right. No hair dryers, no microfiber turbans, just damp misery. And if you must go out, she says, you do what we all do, powder it dry. It creates the illusion of freshness and also adds a certain volume, though unfortunately, it's the same powder used on one's thighs to reduce chafing. You learn to live with it. Historians still argue whether some women simply gave up entirely and kept their hair under wraps, or if the famed occasional rinse was more folklore than fact. What is certain, these weren't quick, convenient rinses. They were coordinated affairs, like military campaigns, but with less shouting and more lavender vinegar. You ask about the soap. She winces. Lye soap, she says. Homemade. Sometimes goat's milk if you're lucky. Sometimes ashes and hog fat if you're not. If it goes wrong, it turns your scalp red and your soul darker. You imagine sitting with your head over a basin while someone slowly ladles hot water across your skull, whispering an apology with each pour. You imagine the smell of old wood, damp towels, and singed hair ends. You see now why we don't do it often, she says. You do. And drying? She sighs. You blot, you wring, you sit near the fire if it's not summer. And if it is summer, you sit by an open window with a book held above your head to shield your curls from dust. Then you braid it loosely and sleep with your head propped like a goose on a stand. Because if you flatten the back of your hair, people will notice. You want to ask more, but she raises one gloved finger. The best days, she says dreamily, are the days you don't wash at all. You simply brush. Brush until the scalp tingles. Until the hair lies flat like a well-trained cat. And you add just a hint of oil. Castor, if you're lucky. Whale oil, if you're not. Another casual horror. Whale oil. There are recipes, she says, eyes sparkling now. 1 part vodka, 1 part egg yolk, a drop of lemon, and a whisper of ammonia. Leaves the hair shiny, but don't get it in your eyes or lungs. You decide it's probably better not to know what happened to women who did get it in their lungs. Of course, she adds with a touch of pride, we do have one trick. The dry wash. Dry wash. She smiles like she's about to let you in on a secret society. A mix of orris root, starch, and sometimes powdered charcoal. Rubbed into the scalp, left for an hour, then brushed out vigorously. It doesn't clean your hair, but it makes you forget you didn't. She pauses and looks at you, solemn now. So when you asked me how I did my hair, I hope you now realize what you were really asking was, how do I survive the crushing expectation of being clean, composed, and coiffed in a world where boiling water is a luxury? You nod quietly. And she smiles. Good, now, shall we discuss powder? Powder, she says, with the calm reverence of someone discussing sacred relics or dangerous explosives. It's not optional. It's not decorative. It's not even especially pleasant. But it is, she insists, absolutely necessary. You brace yourself. The great lie, she says, is that powder is for looks. In truth, powder is for war. Against smell, against sweat, against visible evidence that we are living creatures with skin and scalps and unfortunate sebaceous glands. She says it so gently, it almost sounds poetic. What she means is, hair powder was Victorian dry shampoo, setting spray, deodorant, perfume, and optical illusion all in one chalky puff. She reaches under a small velvet bag beside her and produces an invisible, imaginary puff, a ghostly little cloud between 2 fingers. Rice flour mostly, or starch. Sometimes potato flour, if one's cook is generous with leftovers. Add a little powdered orris root for scent, and if you're rich enough, just a dash of crushed pearl. For shimmer, you blink. Did she say crushed pearl? Oh yes, she nods. It gives the hair that faint glow, like moonlight or mold. Depending on the weather, the mainstream historical truth here is that powdering hair was a carryover from the Georgian era, one that lingered into certain Victorian circles, especially among older or more traditional women. Though not as universally popular as in the 18th century, the habit of applying powder, especially for volume and scent, did persist. She leans in conspiratorially. Of course, we never use just a little. That's the trap. You start with a dab and then suddenly you're puffing like a chimney. Hair powder on the crown, under the bun, along the temples, and your shoulders always dusted. Always. Otherwise, it looks incomplete, like forgetting to button your collar. You can see it now. Clouds of powder filling the boudoir, choking every breath, settling onto carpets, cats, and guests. She nods approvingly. It also helps mask unpleasantries, she adds. After 3 or 4 weeks without a wash, even the daintiest head begins to rebel. Powder is the truce between you and your scalp. You ask if it ever clumps. Her face darkens. Only once, she says flatly. I attended a dinner where the humidity was appalling, and the starch began to gelatinize. I left looking like a bread roll. Historians still debate whether certain classes used powder more than others, or whether powdering fell fully out of fashion after 1850. Some claim working-class women only used powder for lice control. Others argue that the habit remained alive in rural communities, or among widows clinging to older styles. She taps her finger against the table in thought. Men powder too, you know, though more discreetly. A bit at the temples, the clergy especially, something about dignity. Though I once saw a vicar sneeze and leave a white halo on his own shoulder. You chuckle. But powder isn't just practical, she continues. It's architectural. It gives the hair bulk, height, shape. You can't achieve this, she gestures at her own towering bouffant, without a little cloud beneath the scaffolding. Now comes the fringe detail, the quirky tidbit that turns this into a very different kind of bedtime history. There was a woman in Brighton, she begins, who became famous for her lavender powder. It was purple, bright violet. She insisted it kept the spirits at bay, said her hair could summon visions. Naturally, the neighborhood children called her the spectral granny. You want to ask if the lavender worked. She raises an eyebrow. Her husband left, and her cat refused to sleep on her pillow. You decide. And the application process? She guides you through it slowly, like a recipe. You lean forward. Drape a cloth over your shoulders. Tap the puff twice, no more. Begin at the roots and move outward. And you must close your eyes. If it gets in them, they'll burn for hours. That part, apparently, is non-negotiable. Once applied, you wait. Let it set. Let it mingle with the oils, the sweat, the day's intentions. Then you brush. Gently. Never tug. And then, if you're very lucky, you resemble a person of calm, powdered elegance. If you're not, you resemble a bag of dropped flour. She pauses, lost in memory. I once used too much lemon starch. The scent was so strong the maid fainted. Collapsed right onto the chaise. It took her 20 minutes to recover. You glance at her elaborate hairstyle again. You wonder how much of it is real. How much is powder, and how much is pure, stubborn will. And yes, she adds, anticipating your next question, the powder gets everywhere. Your pillow, your hat, your soup if you're not careful. But that's the cost of civilization. She reaches for her invisible puff again and smiles faintly. Besides, it smells better than what lies beneath. You haven't even made it to the combs yet, and already your scalp itches in sympathy. But she's not done, not even close. She straightens a fraction, her powdered hair remaining perfectly still, and gestures toward the towering bun at the back of her head. Of course, what you're seeing here, she says, isn't just hair. It's structure, it's interior design. It's load-bearing. You think she's joking. She's not. See, she continues, if you want a hairstyle that stays upright during a carriage ride, a rainstorm, or a particularly emotional piano recital, you can't rely on hope and hot air. You need infrastructure. This is the section where the geometry of pain comes in. Pins, combs, frames, wires. Victorian hairstyles weren't just arranged, they were engineered, and sometimes armed. We used pins, she says plainly, by the dozen. Bone, brass, tortoiseshell, silver. You learn to feel them settle in place like anchors in your scalp. If one falls out during tea, it is a minor scandal. If 3 fall out, you go home in disgrace. You imagine waking up every morning to this ritual of stabs and sculpting, your head slowly becoming a pincushion. She continues, totally unfazed. Some ladies used cages, lightweight wire cages, to support the volume. You'd insert the padding first, wool, horsehair, or crimped silk, and then wrap the real hair over it like a curtain, then pin, comb, coil, all before breakfast. The mainstream fact here is that 19th century women did indeed use forms and fillers called rats or rats' nests, sometimes even made from their own shed hair collected from brushes, to build volume. Sometimes this involved actual wire frames, especially in the mid-19th century, as hairstyles reached skyward like pastry towers. Of course, she adds thoughtfully, the comb is a weapon as well. Not literally, though I did once strike a man who interrupted me during pinning. But metaphorically, a proper comb orders the world, separates strands from chaos, smooths intentions. She sighs. The problem is, combs break, pins bend, and once, in 1864, a woman in Leeds accidentally skewered her own ear. You blink. On purpose? No, she sneezed mid-twist, very tragic. Her hat flew off. The whole town knew by supper. You're not sure whether to laugh or be horrified. Historians still argue, she muses, whether the elaborate styles of the period were a form of social resistance or just sadistic fashion trends passed down like inherited trauma. Either way, we endured. And there's something admirable in that endurance. Because, as she now demonstrates, creating these styles without a mirror you can trust, and sometimes without a maid, was an act of pure stubborn will. She reaches behind her imaginary head. The first twist goes left, always left. You anchor with 2 pins. Then comb downward, not too tight, or you'll break the wave. Coil, tuck, twist again, then comb horizontally. You're dizzy just listening. Oh, and don't forget to breathe. Sometimes we do, especially when the style is high and the nerves are tight. Quirky tidbit time. You're in luck. There was a duchess once, she says, who insisted on having a bird's nest placed inside her chignon. An actual one. Empty, of course, but real. Said it made her feel closer to nature. It made the staff feel closer to resignation. The image is absurd and oddly charming. A hairdo with nesting rights. She shakes her head slightly. The worst, she murmurs, is when a pin slips during supper. You feel it slide, slowly, like betrayal. You have to smile, keep eating, and pray it doesn't fall into your pudding, or your mother-in-law's. You're starting to realize how much effort Victorian women put into maintaining the illusion of effortlessness. How a single loose curl could ruin an evening, or a reputation. And the headaches, she adds, voice softening. Oh, the headaches. We call them glory aches. You'll recognize them by the sound of a woman hissing as she removes her pins at midnight. You ask how many pins she's wearing right now. She considers. 17. And that's just visible ones. There are 3 more keeping the back twist stable, and 1 emergency pin near the nape in case of laughter. Of course, there's a laughter contingency pin. You ask if she ever wishes she could just let it all down. She blinks. Do you know what happens when a Victorian woman lets her hair down in public? You don't. She either faints, proposes marriage, or gets arrested. Possibly all 3. Fair enough. So you sit quietly, trying to imagine the physical toll. The weight, the sharp jabs, the knowledge that if one tiny tool slips out of place, the entire sculpture may collapse like a poorly planned soufflé. And as she reaches behind her head with an air of slow ritual, gently removing a single imaginary pin and placing it on the vanity, she whispers, "Only 20 more to go." She's removed 1 pin, just 1, and already there's a subtle shift in the air, as though the room is holding its breath, afraid that removing a second might bring the whole architectural marvel crumbling down like a Victorian wigwam made of secrets and vanity. You, meanwhile, are trying to comprehend how hair could possibly weigh that much without becoming classified as structural roofing. Of course, she says with a soft sigh. If one had the means, one didn't rely on hair alone. No, no. One supplemented, one enhanced, one outsourced. She lifts a gloved hand and gestures vaguely to the crown of her head. This bun, she says, only partly mine. The rest came by post. You blink. Came by post? Oh yes, she replies sweetly. False hair was quite the commodity. You could order it by weight, by color, even by provenance. Some women preferred French hair. Others swore by Bavarian. I myself favored Scottish. Excellent wave retention. The mainstream historical reality is that by the mid-19th century, the demand for false hair had exploded across Europe and America. Real human hair was sold, traded, and advertised in newspapers. Wigs, falls, and chignons were as common in upper-class parlors as umbrellas in London rain. Of course, she continues, warming to her topic, not all hair came from willing donors. And not all buyers asked too many questions. That's where the worrying rumors start. She leans in closer. There were whispers. Whispers that some hair was cut from the heads of the dead, that unscrupulous collectors scoured graveyards after storms, hoping to find a fresh scalp, that funeral homes in France ran side businesses on the side. You pause, mid-breath. Historians still debate whether this was widespread or just morbid gossip, she says, waving one hand. But even the most reputable shops never quite told you where it came from. You just trusted the label said cleaned and tried not to think too hard. You ask what she means by cleaned. Her smile turns distant. Boiled, combed, scented with rosewater or clove. Hung to dry in long tresses over cedar rods. But sometimes there was a smell, a faint one. Like mothballs and rain-soaked wool. If it didn't fade, you wore lavender and kept your distance. And if someone asked, you said it was from Italy. That usually ended the conversation. Quirky fact incoming. There was a woman in Bath, she says, who claimed her hairpiece was woven from her late husband's beard. Said it kept his memory close and his opinions even closer. Naturally, she never remarried. Of course she didn't. You ask if there were synthetic options. She scoffs delicately. We had a few. Thread and horsehair, mostly. But they looked ghastly. Coarse. The sort of hair a villainess in a penny novel might wear while plotting in the attic. She stands, brushing invisible lint from her skirts. False hair had to match, not just the color, but the class. No one wanted a streak of reddish flax in a head of coal-black glory, so we dyed it. Vinegar for lightening. Soot for darkening. Rust water for auburn, if you were brave. Some girls boiled onion skins to create a honey tone. The kitchen often doubled as a salon. You can't help but admire the ingenuity, the relentless creativity, the complete lack of sanitation. And the deception, she says, smiling now, was part of the fun. No one admitted to wearing false hair, but we all did. It was like knowing which neighbor padded her bust, or who used rouge made of beetles. A polite society of elegant lies. You ask how she kept it from falling out. Oh, pins, mostly. And spit. But only if you were desperate. There's a pause. Then she nods solemnly. I've had desperate days. You try to imagine it. Victorian drawing rooms filled with women whose hairstyles were 40% aspiration, 30% ingenuity, and maybe 30% stranger hair from another postcode. And remember, she adds, these pieces had to be maintained. Brushed daily, re-oiled weekly, stored on padded stands shaped like human heads. And if you didn't, well, Have you ever seen what happens to neglected hair in a damp linen drawer? You hadn't, but now you're picturing it. Once, she says, I found an old chignon in my aunt's wardrobe. It had grown a sort of fuzz, a colony, almost. We held a quiet funeral and burned it behind the rose arbor. You ask if she ever wears her hair all natural. She looks slightly horrified. Darling, she whispers, natural is for nuns, widows, and Wednesdays before noon. The rest of the time, it is your duty to appear composed. And with that, she plucks another imaginary pin from her coiffure, places it beside the first, and smiles. 1 down, 21 to go. Shall we continue? She takes a slow breath. One of those dramatic Victorian inhales that suggests lace corsets, subtle judgment, and the distant sound of harp music, and lets her fingers hover over her towering hairstyle. Now, we come to the real elegance, she says softly. Wigs. You shift in your seat. Wasn't that what the false hair was for? Oh no, dear, she says with faint amusement. False hair is an accent. A garnish, a flourish. A wig, though, that is a full commitment. It is the hairstyle equivalent of fleeing the country and assuming a new identity. The mainstream historical fact here is that while full wigs had declined in daily fashion by the Victorian period, unlike in the powdered pomp era of the 18th century, they never fully vanished. Wigs remained important for those with thinning hair, medical conditions, stage performers, or simply the rich who didn't want to deal with everyday coiffure maintenance. Especially among older ladies, wigs were considered both practical and occasionally a little scandalous. They were common enough, she continues, lifting an invisible velvet box from the air. Though never spoken of, you'd never say you wore one. But you'd notice, wouldn't you? A woman arrives at supper with curls she did not have at tea. That's always a clue. You ask what they were made from. Human hair, of course, when possible. The best was Russian. Thick, cooperative, not prone to frizz. But some used yak hair, some horse. A few enterprising souls even tried doll hair. You could always tell the shine was unnatural, like polished beetles. She tilts her head just slightly. I once owned a wig made from Icelandic hair. Lovely color, but I swear it shifted in the moonlight. It gave people the wrong impression. Wrong impression. They thought I was whimsical. I'm not. I'm very precise. You nod quickly. And the maintenance, she adds. Wigs had to be brushed, powdered, scented, and aired. A neglected wig will develop what we call parlor rot. That is to say, it begins to smell like damp upholstery and poorly cooked turnips. Quirky tidbit, incoming. There was a woman in Devon who named all her wigs. She kept 7, 1 for each day of the week. They sat on velvet stands in her dressing room like powdered sentinels. On Thursdays she wore melancholia. It had one curl that never cooperated, and she said it reflected her inner mood. You ask how often she wears a wig. She gives a slow, sly smile. Not often, only for funerals, political discussions, or when I visit my cousin Eugenia. Her hair is quite real and always insists on reminding everyone. It's exhausting. You ask how it feels. Like placing a sleeping cat on your head, she says, matter of fact. Warm. Heavy. A bit judgmental. You walk carefully. You don't bend forward, and you never, ever sneeze. Historians still argue whether wigs were primarily a health measure to cover thinning hair or lice-related shaving, a vanity tool, or an economic display. But one thing is certain. Wig shops flourished. Newspapers advertised them. Traveling wig makers roamed the countryside. A well-dressed woman might own 3 or 4, even if she only admitted to one, and always claimed it was a family piece. The scandal, she adds, lowering her voice, was not in wearing a wig, but in being caught adjusting it. You ask how they stayed on. Oh, there are methods, she says lightly. Straps, combs, hatpins. One brave woman used beeswax until the summer heat made her regret everything. She stepped out of the carriage and her entire hairstyle slid to her shoulder like a melting pastry. That image will live in your mind forever. But wigs had their advantages, she muses. No brushing, no curling. No agony over humidity. Slip it on, anchor it properly, and you're ready to conquer a garden party. Or a duel. Depending on the hour. You ask if anyone ever wore 2 wigs. She doesn't even blink. There's a phrase among the elder set, she says. Double-crowned, doubly dangerous. I leave you to interpret that as you wish. You suspect it means exactly what it sounds like. Then she reaches delicately for another imaginary pin, this one smaller, hidden near the base of her bun, and slides it free. Wigs, she says with a final nod, are for when the world demands too much. They are a polite way of saying, not today, reality, not today. She sets the imaginary wig box aside with the careful grace of someone who has absolutely done this before, possibly several times, possibly in the middle of a thunderstorm. And now she says it's time to talk about where all that hair comes from. Not yours, of course. Don't be ridiculous. From other people, preferably strangers. Ideally with thick, glossy locks, and no questions asked. Hair, she says, was a booming business. You blink. You'd assumed hair just appeared. Like seasonal fruit. But no. In the Victorian world, hair had its own economy. It was bought, sold, traded. And occasionally stolen, she says. There were markets, auctions, even traveling buyers who paid cash for tresses and disappeared before anyone thought to ask their full names. The mainstream fact is that the 19th century human hair trade was massive. In Europe especially, young girls and women from poorer regions, like rural Italy, Ireland, and parts of Eastern Europe, sold their hair for surprisingly high sums. It was considered honest work. Odd perhaps, but honest. There were rules, she says. Buyers preferred virgin hair, never curled, dyed, or scorched. Length was prized, but color mattered too. Blonde fetched more. Red was niche, black, dependable. Brown with a natural wave, jackpot. She pauses, then leans in. My own switch came from a girl in the Tyrol. 17 inches, honey brown, absolutely heavenly. I still have the ribbon it came tied with, mauve silk. You ask if the girls were treated fairly. She gives a non-committal shrug. Some were, others not so much. There were tales of unscrupulous dealers cutting more than promised, or paying in tokens instead of coin. One even shaved a girl's head while she slept. Claimed he mistook her for a relative. Quirky detail. Here it comes. There was a famous case, she says, of a Scottish woman who cut off her hair to pay for her brother's passage to Canada. The hair was woven into 3 different switches, 2 of which ended up in Buckinghamshire, and 1 in a brooch on a poet's desk. History is a tangled thing. You ask if people ever wore hair from someone they knew. Oh, certainly, she says. But usually only after they died. She says this so calmly you almost miss it. Mourning hair was very fashionable. You'd take a lock from the deceased, twist it into a ring or pin it inside a locket. But some families went further. Wreaths, garlands, entire floral arrangements made of braided hair, hung in shadow boxes, displayed in parlors. Quite tasteful, really. You can't decide if that's tender or terrifying. Historians still debate whether these customs were driven by grief, superstition, or simply the Victorians' deep-seated need to decorate everything. But a proper mourning brooch was as common as a black veil. She folds her hands neatly. And then, of course, there were the hair swindlers. Swindlers. Oh, yes. Men who posed as buyers only to run off with bundles before paying. Or worse, dealers who mixed human hair with animal fur to increase volume. One woman discovered badger bristles sewn into her curls and spent 6 weeks with a scalp rash. You flinch. Understandably, she smiles politely. Don't worry. I've never had such misfortune. My dealer is quite reputable, very discreet. Works out of a bakery in Soho. You open your mouth, then wisely close it again. And naturally, she adds, some ladies collect hair, like stamps. Or lovers. They keep little envelopes marked with names and dates, hair from friends, sisters, even rivals. It's not strange exactly, just sentimental, like carrying pieces of memory. You ask if she's ever done this. She pauses. Only once, she says softly. A dear friend. She moved to Bombay. I have one of her curls in a book of poetry. It smells faintly of bergamot and moths. And suddenly, you feel something shift. Behind all the pins and powder, there's something tender, human, almost soft. Hair, she says at last, is the most stubborn thing we own. It grows, it resists, it remembers, and when it's gone, it becomes legend. She picks up another imaginary pin and places it beside the others on the dressing table. One day, she adds, my own switches will be worn by someone else. Or perhaps woven into something ridiculous. Either way, I won't be there to complain. You sit quietly as she adjusts a curl with a phantom touch. And just when you think the worst is behind you, powder clouds, mourning wreaths, whispering wigs, she gives you a look. The kind of look that Victorian women likely used to silence roomfuls of suitors and startled maids. We've talked about hair, she says, but not about how it got to me. You brace yourself. I never cut my own switches, she begins. I buy them, yes, but I have standards. Some women don't. Some women harvest. Harvest, that's the word she uses. There were whole towns, she explains, where women were known not for their needlework or preserves, but for their hair, thick, glossy braids grown not out of pride, but out of economic necessity. Girls would grow their hair long, braid it, and sell it by the ounce. Like wool, like tobacco. The mainstream historical truth here is that selling human hair became a livelihood in many parts of 19th century Europe. Hair brokers, many of them men, would travel to rural villages, offering pennies for inches. It was especially common before major life events, marriage, travel, even joining a convent. The hair buyers came in spring, she says, almost wistfully, like swallows. They'd set up outside churches or markets, offer a few coins and a ribbon. The prettier the girl, the better the price. And if you brought in sisters, a bonus. She smooths an invisible wrinkle in her skirt. It was brisk business. You ask how they cut it. Quickly, she says. With long scissors and a practiced hand, they'd pull the braid taut and snip. Like butchering a flower. And then the hair would vanish, off to wig makers, to wealthy city women, or to the gray, boxy warehouses that stored it in bundles wrapped in tissue like pressed flowers. Some dealers sold it directly, others had middlemen. And some operated just barely on the edge of the law. There were cases, she adds, of women being tricked, told the scissors were for measuring. Then, snip, gone, and no compensation. One poor soul was told it would grow back blonder if she drank gin and wept in the sun. That was the same year hair theft became a recognized crime in Bristol. Historians still argue about the extent of exploitation in the trade. Some saw it as honest opportunity for the poor. Others decried it as bodily theft, disguised in ribbons. There were even salons, she says with a trace of scandal in her voice, where city women would go and select from the bundles, tied, labeled, arranged by color and texture, like shopping for silk. "I'll have this brunette cascade, please. No split ends." You ask if she's ever bought directly. "Once," she says, "from a girl named Elsie, 11 years old. She cried when the braid was cut, but her mother smiled and said, 'That'll get you a new shawl and 2 hens.' So, who am I to say? You wonder how she felt afterward. Guilty, she says plainly, but also beautiful. That's the truth. We want to believe beauty comes without cost, but it doesn't. It never has. Quirky tidbit. There was a trend, briefly, she adds, of attaching hair not to one's head but to hats. Yes, truly. Long locks sewn into bonnets, so one could transform with a tilt. Some enterprising soul tried a reversible model, blonde on one side, brunette on the other. It caught fire. Literally. There were feathers involved. Tragic. You try not to laugh. She allows herself a very tight smile. But mostly, she says, we wear other people's hair on our heads without ever knowing their names. That's the strange intimacy of it. You could be walking down the promenade with the hair of a girl from Florence brushing your collar. And as she speaks, she removes another imaginary pin. One of the longer ones. "Not mine," she murmurs. "French?" From a convent girl. Supposedly she had visions. Visions? "Yes," she says, voice almost dreamy. She said an angel told her to cut it and donate it to the cause of beauty. I rather think she just hated the weight. But still, the gesture lingers. You sit back and imagine it. Hair drifting across borders, across oceans, across lives. And how much of Victorian elegance was stitched together from silent braided economies. "I suppose," she says finally, "if anyone ever wears my hair one day, I hope they wear it well, and that they have better pins." By now, you've heard enough to start eyeing your own pillowcase with suspicion, but before you can even frame a question, she lifts a gloved finger and says, "Now, we come to something sentimental." You brace yourself. Sentimental in Victorian terms could mean anything from romantic to mildly haunted. Hair, she says softly, was not just for fashion. It was for memory. For mourning. For love. You tilt your head. She's already said a bit about this, but now there's a flicker in her voice. Something closer to reverence. "Have you ever seen a hair wreath?" she asks. You haven't. "Oh, you'd remember if you had," she says with a knowing smile. They're not small or subtle. They're made from the hair of family members, twisted and shaped into flowers. Sometimes just a few curls arranged like daisies. Other times, entire grapevines of braided hair looping across velvet, sealed behind glass, displayed right in the parlor. You blink. "It's a kind of immortality," she says. You die, but your hair stays. Your sister braids it, your mother curls it. Your daughter pins it into an arrangement and hangs it above the fireplace. The mainstream fact here is that Victorian hair art was a very real, very widespread practice. Especially during the height of mourning culture in the mid-1800s, families crafted intricate floral displays using the hair of deceased loved ones. These weren't morbid, at least not to Victorians. They were deeply personal, homemade relics. Historians still argue, she continues, whether these were acts of grief, art, or quiet rebellion against forgetting. But every household had at least one. Some homes had entire walls. And if you weren't mourning someone, "Oh," she says, "you could still make jewelry." Hair brooches, rings, pocket watch fobs, friendship bracelets, engagement tokens, even cufflinks. Why, a lady might braid a lock of her own hair into a man's watch chain, a kind of premarital branding. She says it so casually, as if it's obvious you'd want a loved one's DNA looped around your wrist. There was a fashion, she goes on, for sending hair in love letters, tied in a bow placed inside a pressed flower, sometimes perfumed, sometimes not. The bold ones would snip from just behind the ear. More personal. Quirky tidbit, of course. One woman sent a full plait to her suitor wrapped in a corset ribbon and a map of the Lake District. He proposed within a week. It was later discovered the hair belonged to her cousin. But the marriage was happy. You ask if she's ever worn hair jewelry. "Oh yes," she replies. "This brooch," she taps an imaginary piece on her collar, "contains my grandmother's hair." Auburn. She lived through 6 wars and a house fire. I like to think a bit of that stubbornness comes through. And yes, there were jewelers who specialized in hair work. Delicate artisans who could braid a strand tighter than a violin string. Their tools were fine hooks and wire loops. Their designs were floral mostly. Forget-me-nots, roses, weeping willows. But you had to trust them, she adds. Some were notorious for mixing strands. If you sent in your mother's hair and received back something clearly masculine and black, you had to write very stern letters. She pauses. There was a scandal once in Manchester. A woman realized her mourning brooch was made from horsehair and a bit of wool. She collapsed at the haberdasher's in a heap. You can't help but imagine it. Shelves lined with labeled hair samples, tins of clippings, perhaps even a secret drawer of miscellaneous strands. Victorian sentimentality, it turns out, had a filing system. And the men? Oh, they wore hair too, she says. In lockets. In rings. Woven into the band of their hats. A lock of hair was a quiet way to say, "I am loved." Or "I have lost." Or sometimes, quite frankly, "I am watching you." You ask if it was ever creepy. She tilts her head. Only if the person didn't know. Fair. But for most of us, she continues gently, it was comfort. After all, there's something strangely reassuring about holding on to someone's hair. It's the last part of them to go, the most durable, the most quietly defiant. You sit for a moment, letting that settle. And then, with a sigh, she removes another invisible pin, this one smaller, almost delicate, and places it beside the growing pile on the table. "I suppose," she says, "if memory must fade, it's nice to have something braided to hold on to." She lets the last pin rest gently with its companions and gives you a look that says she's only warming up. "Now," she declares, lifting her chin a bit higher, "let's talk about deception." You shift slightly in your seat. "Not the cruel kind," she adds with a slight smile. "Just the polite kind. The kind that says, 'Yes, this hair is mine,' while conveniently forgetting to mention that half of it was sewn in before breakfast. Because the truth is, no matter how elaborate a Victorian woman's hair looked, its bouncy volume, its gentle curls, its perfect sculpted height, much of it was artifice. False hair we've covered, but beyond that, there were hairpieces, falls and fringes, mini wigs, partial wigs, and tiny add-ons that turned thin, exhausted tresses into something worthy of a portrait. The fall, she begins, was a cascade of curls or braids, pinned near the crown to lengthen one's silhouette. Ideal for balls. The fringe? Well, that was trickier. It sat just above the brow, curled unnaturally, and had a habit of slipping during vigorous conversation. Mainstream fact. By the mid to late 19th century, hairpieces had become ubiquitous. Advertisements for them appeared in women's magazines. Some were clipped in, others were sewn in, and many were padded with wire or wool to give the illusion of fullness. A woman with very little natural hair could still present a formidable coiffure in public, with just a few well-placed tricks. She gives you a slightly wicked smile. I once met a woman whose entire updo was supported by one discreet sausage-shaped pillow. She'd wrapped her remaining curls around it, anchored it with 12 pins, and walked through a thunderstorm without a single slip. Remarkable woman. Terrible poetry. You ask how many pieces she wears. Depends on the day, she says. 2, usually. 1 for volume, 1 for shape. If it's a funeral, perhaps 3, and a hat, always a hat. For stability and mystery, she picks up an invisible comb and begins smoothing a phantom lock. Of course, you must blend carefully. No one wants to see where your real hair ends and your ambitions begin. You picture the effort. Matching shades, hiding seams, securing every curl with a prayer and a ribbon. And if it failed? There were disasters, she says lightly. A debutante once stood too close to a fire, and her fringe shriveled like a feather in a gas lamp. She cried. Someone offered her blancmange. It didn't help. She tells you about a clever girl who invented a wiglet, a ring of hair to wear under a bonnet, so it looked like you'd styled your hair, when in fact you were still in your nightgown. She called it her illusion ring, she says. Eventually patented it. Retired to the coast. Quirky tidbit. Naturally. There was a salon in Brighton that offered an entire catalogue of pre-curled hairpieces. Customers could choose based on shape. The Duchess, the Governess, the Scandal. My sister once bought the Thunderstorm by mistake. She didn't leave the house for 3 days. You ask if men noticed. Rarely, she says. They assumed we simply woke up symmetrical. Or didn't think about it at all. If you wore it confidently, it might as well have been sewn by angels. Historians still debate the full extent to which hairpieces were embraced across social classes. But what's certain is that from middle-class women to stage performers to aristocrats, there was a quiet, unspoken pact. Real hair was not the only kind worth styling. And as she reaches for another invisible pin, she leans forward, voice dropping to a near whisper. It's all smoke and mirrors, but we do it for one another, for the illusion, for the harmony, for the sense that somewhere, beneath it all, we've got this figured out. You nod. Not because you do, but because you wish you did. Besides, she says, leaning back, when the deception works, you don't feel false. You feel finished. Another pin joins the growing pile. And in a world full of coal smoke, damp petticoats, and telegrams bringing bad news, feeling finished, even for a few hours, is the closest thing to magic. By now, her tone has shifted. It's less confessional, more like she's guiding you through a sacred rite, one that involves scalp discomfort, artistry, and the faint smell of singed duck feathers. Of course, she says, almost wistfully, none of this works without heat. You blink. Heat? Yes, she continues, producing an imaginary iron rod from thin air. Curling? Sculpting. Taming. All of it depends on the brave application of scalding metal to vulnerable hair, and occasionally to vulnerable ears. Welcome to the perilous world of early Victorian hairstyling tools. She gestures again, and you begin to picture the scene. An iron rod, maybe 6 inches long, heated over a small oil lamp or placed directly in the fire, then removed and used with terrifying confidence by a maid who either has the steadiest hands in London or none at all. We had curling tongs, of course, she says, simple ones. Metal, shaped like giant tweezers. You heat them, you test them on paper. If the paper scorches, they're too hot. If it doesn't, they're probably still too hot. Then you pray. Mainstream fact: Victorian curling irons were unregulated and wildly inconsistent. Some had wooden handles, but most didn't insulate well. There were stories of entire locks burned clean off the scalp. Testing them on paper was common advice, but not foolproof. I once knew a woman who lost half her fringe before breakfast, she says. Her maid apologized and offered lemon curd as a peace gesture. It didn't help. You ask if she still uses irons. Only when I must, she says. The trick is to heat them just enough to scare the hair into submission without setting it on fire. It's a delicate balance, like flirting with a Frenchman. She turns, mimicking the motion of wrapping hair around the iron. Hold. Twist. Release. Then pin it in place until it cools. That's the secret. Cooling. Most women ruin the curl by touching it too soon. Like baking. Historians still argue whether heat styling was reserved for special occasions or an everyday practice. Evidence suggests that for the wealthier classes, especially in cities, heat styling was common, despite the risk, because sleek, shaped hair was considered a marker of discipline and taste. And then there were crimpers, she adds with a faint shudder, metal presses with zigzag teeth. Supposed to give texture, mostly gave migraines. You ask how long it takes. 2 hours, she says without hesitation. Minimum, if the weather cooperates. If not, you're chasing curls with your maid and muttering Latin curses under your breath. In summer, it's unbearable. In winter, you risk freezing your fringe solid. Quirky tidbit? Oh, I knew a girl who trained her parlor boy to watch the irons and call out when they glowed just right. He was 8, very serious, claimed the tongs spoke to him. He later became a choir director. You picture it. A small child whispering to metal tools, calling them ready, like some kind of domestic oracle. Of course, she continues, there were accidents, ears singed. Foreheads blistered. One woman leaned too close to her fire while wearing curlers and had to pat herself out with a gardening journal. She later became a hat enthusiast. You ask about chemical curling. Oh no, she says wide-eyed. That came later, too unpredictable. We had potions, of course. Vinegar rinses, rose water mists, even sugar water to set the curl. But nothing like your modern concoctions. We preferred a direct threat, iron to hair. The old-fashioned way. You can't help but notice how casually she describes what amounts to low-key hair combat. But she seems unfazed. It teaches patience, she says. Discipline. You can't rush a curl. You must earn it. And as she gently lifts another imaginary pin from the back of her head and sets it beside the others, she sighs, not sadly, but with the weary pride of someone who's survived something difficult and culturally enforced. There's a certain serenity, she says, in knowing that every ringlet came at a cost, and a certain joy in seeing them bounce, finally like small victories. She presses her gloved fingertips together thoughtfully, and you notice her nose wrinkle, just faintly. Let's talk about the real glamour, she says with gentle sarcasm. The kind no one discusses openly. The goops, the glazes, the glistening messes we called styling products. You instinctively lean back. Oh yes, she continues, voice syrupy. Before mousse, before hairspray, before anything with a nozzle, we had lard, goose fat. Bear grease if you were fancy, and if you were truly unfortunate, raw egg white mixed with a whisper of rum. You cough. She does not smile. The idea, she says patiently, was to tame, to weigh the hair down just enough to keep it in place without making it look like you'd oiled a baking tin and then rolled through it face first. Mainstream fact. Victorian women used a wide variety of homemade or shop-bought hair treatments. Common ingredients included beef marrow, castor oil, pomades scented with herbs, brandy, glycerin, and even borax water. Commercial pomades were often petroleum-based and stored in elegant tins that belied the sticky truth within. You wanted sheen, not shine, she clarifies. A healthy glow, not the glint of a buttered crumpet. She gestures to her scalp with mock delicacy. I, for example, favor a blend of castor oil and rosemary steeped in vinegar. Just a dab at the temples and nape. Brushed in with a boar bristle, of course. It smells faintly of roast chicken, but gives the hair such obedience. You ask if people ever made their own. Constantly, she says. There were whole recipe books devoted to it. Women passed them down like secret grimoires. One aunt swore by onion skins and gin. Another rubbed brandy and sugar into her scalp. Claimed it encouraged growth and marital loyalty. You can't decide which is more questionable. Historians still argue whether these concoctions had any real effect, she says, pausing to pluck another invisible pin, or were simply the comforting rituals of a society desperate to control at least one part of a wildly unpredictable life. And honestly, it checks out. Victorian Britain was a world of fog, grief, industrial soot, and etiquette landmines. If you couldn't decide your future, at least you could decide your hair texture. Of course, she adds with a slow blink, some recipes were more experimental. I knew a woman who mixed beeswax and molasses. The result was stunning, but she once stepped outside on a hot day and attracted a cloud of wasps. She says this as though it's simply one of life's occasional lessons. And then there were the stores, she continues. Tiny perfumeries and hair salons run by serious-faced women with serious-smelling jars. You'd walk in, sit down, and they'd pull out little tins marked with things like scalp unguent or curl cement. You didn't ask, you simply submitted. Quirky tidbit time. There was a shop on Oxford Street, she says, that offered a vegetable-based glossy infusion. Turned out to be mashed peas, lard, and some kind of fermented grain. One woman claimed her hair grew 2 inches in a month. Another claimed it attracted foxes. You ask if any of these worked. Possibly, she concedes. Or perhaps the belief was enough. We had no guarantees, no dermatologists. Just hope in a jar and the occasional herbalist with a terrifying mustache. She reaches into the air again and mimics unscrewing a small tin. The key, she says, was moderation. Too little, and the hair frizzed. Too much, and you looked like a wax figure left in the sun. And then there was the matter of smell, she sighs. Some pomades were sweet. Orange blossom, rose, lavender. But others, tallow and cloves. Goose grease and coal tar. One girl's braid once set off the fire alarm in the reading room. You stare at her. Not literally, she clarifies. But someone did faint. Finally, she reaches up to remove another invisible pin. This one slower, almost tenderly. You imagine the residue of a day's worth of effort, sweat, and perhaps a faint glaze of bear grease. Hair, she says, was not just sculpted. It was seasoned. You wince. She nods. Exactly. She sets the invisible pin down with a practiced flick and straightens, her posture so precise it could probably support a bookshelf. Then she raises one perfectly arched brow. Now, she says coolly, let us talk about brushing. You nod cautiously. This seems harmless enough. It isn't, she replies immediately. Of course not. Brushing, she continues, wasn't a chore. It was a ritual, a sign of refinement, a moment of dignity at the end of the day. And a performance, if someone was watching. You blink. She means brushing your hair was a public gesture? Oh yes, she says. A woman brushing her hair, ideally seated at a vanity, bathed in candlelight, eyes lowered, was seen as romantic, mysterious, vaguely poetic. But in reality, it was exercise. It was commitment, and it was absolutely mandatory. Mainstream fact, many Victorian etiquette manuals recommended 100 strokes per night to maintain healthy, glossy hair. Brushing was believed to distribute natural oils from the scalp to the ends of the hair. It was also considered morally beneficial, an act of personal discipline. We used boar bristle brushes, she says. Stiff, but not cruel. Ivory handles if you could afford it, wood or horn if you couldn't, and always cleaned after use. You wouldn't believe the dust those bristles picked up. Hair was a magnet for soot, smoke, and judgment. You imagine the sheer labor of it, sitting every night, methodically brushing, counting out the strokes like rosary beads while the fire crackled nearby. There were techniques, of course, she says, not just back to front like a donkey with a rake. No, you start at the ends, detangle gently. Then work your way up, section by section. Finish with a long sweep from crown to tips, all while maintaining a serene expression in case someone's looking through the drawing room curtains. You ask if anyone ever skipped it. Her face hardens. Only the scandalous or the sick. Then she sighs, softening. I once went 3 days without brushing. A fever. By the end, my hair looked like something a rook had dropped from a tree. Took a full hour and a serving of goose fat to recover. Quirky tidbit time? Naturally. There was a famous painter, she says, who swore his muse's hair was shinier because she brushed it exactly 113 times each night. They married. She later admitted she only ever did 60, but liked the way he looked at her during the first 20. You ask about hairbrushes themselves. They were heirlooms, she says proudly. Engraved, passed down, stored in velvet-lined boxes. My mother's had a silver back etched with chrysanthemums. She used it every evening, whether she needed to or not. Said it kept her thoughts in order. She leans closer. And you never, ever used someone else's brush. That was practically a declaration of war or romance. Sometimes both. Historians still argue whether the 100 strokes a night rule was based on science or simply Victorian obsession with routine and control. Some believe it genuinely improved hair health. Others say it was just another way to measure a woman's discipline. And, she adds, brushing was how you checked for visitors. Visitors? Lice, she says flatly. We checked regularly. Brushes, fine-toothed combs, long mirrors. If you found something, you burned the pillowcase and scalded the brush. And if you were a guest in someone's home when that discovery happened, well, it was understood that you would leave immediately. You ask if there were products to help. Oh, dozens. Vinegar rinses, camphor sprays. Boiled herbs. My grandmother used lavender and gin. She smelled like a distillery, but her scalp was spotless. She carefully mimics a brushing motion, long, graceful sweeps. There's something meditative about it, she says, like sweeping a ballroom, except the floor is your head and the dust is personal. You chuckle. She allows a faint smirk. And of course, she says, voice lowering again, brushing was how we unwound the day, removed the pins, loosened the braids, brushed out the stiffness of the hours. It wasn't just for vanity. It was for closure. You picture it. A woman seated at her mirror, hair falling loose, curls softening, brush in hand, counting to 100. Not because she had to, but because it gave shape to the end of another day filled with corsets, rules, and very firm opinions about soup spoons. She lifts another imaginary pin and lets it fall softly onto the growing pile. Some nights, she says, I brush longer than I should, not for beauty, just for the rhythm. She doesn't move this time, just sits still, gazing faintly into the middle distance, her fingers hovering in midair over the last stretch of her imaginary hairstyle. But what if, she murmurs, despite all the brushing, all the oil, all the vinegar rinses, you begin to notice a thinning? You don't answer. You're not sure if she's speaking to you or to the ghost of her own past volume. She nods once, tightly. Hair loss, she says, was the unspoken terror. Mainstream fact, Victorian women absolutely feared thinning hair, and with good reason. The era's elaborate styles demanded thickness, shine, and obedient volume. And yet their routines, tight buns, harsh brushing, weighty pins, scorching irons, often led to breakage, thinning, and bald patches. It was a perfect storm of high expectations and scalp sabotage. And when it happened, she continues, you didn't talk about it. You took quiet action. You ask, what kind of action? Oh, she says, waving a gloved hand. Tinctures, tonics, lotions with suspicious names and even more suspicious smells. Hair restorers that promised lush regrowth and came with instructions that read like ancient curses. Some of these, she explains, were homemade, steeped rosemary, egg yolks, onion juice, or brandy, massaged into the scalp daily. But the serious ones, she adds, were purchased, and they burned. You wince. There was one, she says, called Dr. Fenwick's Scalp Revivifier, a bright green fluid that smelled like turpentine and regret. I knew a woman who swore by it. Until her eyebrows turned pink, she adds. That same woman also believed in seances, so perhaps not the most reliable review. You ask if she ever tried them. I did, she admits. Once. It tingled, then it burned. Then I cried into a washcloth and pretended nothing had happened. Historians still argue whether these early tonics had any real benefit. Some included ingredients like castor oil or glycerin, which may have helped moisturize the scalp, but many relied on ammonia, alcohol, or even arsenic, substances more likely to poison follicles than nourish them. And of course, she says, there were wigs, as we've discussed, or padding, or clever combing. But the real fear wasn't what others saw. It was what you saw. Each strand in the brush felt like a betrayal. You imagine it, the quiet anxiety of the mirror, the hush of powder covering a receding part, the sharp internal gasp when a maid gently says, "It's thinner today, madam." You couldn't confess it, she says. A man could go bald. It gave him gravitas. But a woman? It was seen as decay. Quirky tidbit time. There was a duchess, she says, who had a secret hair garden, rows of carefully labeled pots, each containing locks from her youth. She claimed they retained energy, said speaking to them restored her volume. No one had the heart to argue. You ask if anyone ever challenged the stigma. Oh, a few, she says, mostly artists, bohemians. There was a poet who shaved her head entirely and wore velvet turbans. Men adored her, but her hair never did grow back. She claimed it was the price of freedom. She leans forward slightly. But for the rest of us, we clung to hope. We blended in other hair. We wore bonnets longer. We bought tonics in secret. And we prayed. You ask if she still worries. Not as much, she says with a shrug. I've learned to forgive my scalp. It's done its best. Besides, a good hat distracts from almost anything. Another imaginary pin slides loose, laid gently on the table beside the others. There's a comfort, she adds, in letting go of what you can't control. even if that means accepting the odd breeze on the back of your head. She folds her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable but calm, like someone who's made peace with the battlefield of her own scalp. "Of course," she says after a pause, "what your hair really says about you isn't just in the texture or the shine. It's in the shape, the style, the structure." You tilt your head, already sensing a shift in tone. In the Victorian world, she continues, hairstyle was a language, a coded message. Your curls didn't just say you liked curls. They said who you were, where you belonged, how you saw yourself, and who you hoped might notice. Mainstream fact. Hairstyles in the Victorian era were deeply connected to social class, age, marital status, and even political or regional identity. A severe center part could signal piety and modesty. Loose ringlets might suggest youth. An updo signified maturity and respectability. The exact positioning of a bun or the ornament in a braid could tell others volumes, without a word. A center part, she explains, meant virtue. A side part, a bit more daring. Ringlets, innocence if you were under 16. Or scandal if you weren't. She nods at her own style. A structured chignon at the nape is safe, respectable. Uncontroversial. You'd wear it to a tea or a wake, but raise it just a bit. Just to the crown, now you're ambitious, assertive. Possibly looking to marry up. You blink. All that from a bun? Oh yes, she replies. Everything meant something. The tighter the coil, the tighter your morals, supposedly. The looser the waves, the looser your character. Also, supposedly. And don't get me started on fringe. You dare. You ask about fringe. Her nose wrinkles. Fringe was contentious. Some saw it as childish. Others saw it as French. Either way, it raised eyebrows, literally and figuratively. There were entire essays about how fringe would ruin the moral fiber of English femininity. One vicar called it forehead vanity. You ask if she ever wore it. She looks away. Once, during a brief period of rebellion, it didn't last. I was 17, and besides, it curled unevenly. Quirky tidbit incoming. There was a lady in York who kept a logbook of her hairstyles, color-coded by season and mood. She believed bun height influenced conversation quality. Said people listened more if her hair reached a certain angle. Her husband called it the elevation method. You ask if men noticed all this nuance. They noticed some things, she says. They noticed when your style changed, or if your hair fell lower on your neck than was strictly decent. But most men, they just hoped it stayed pinned up during supper and didn't ignite near the gas lamps. Historians still debate whether women consciously used hairstyle to express themselves or were simply following etiquette manuals. But most agree that even small changes in a woman's hair signaled something to neighbors, to suitors, to society. There were trends, she continues. Regional ones, religious ones, colonial import. You could spot a woman from India by the oil sheen in her braid, a Scotswoman by the tightness of her knots, a wealthy widow by the silver hairnet catching the light just so. You ask what her style says now. She thinks for a long moment. Then, it says I'm tired of fuss, that I've earned the right to wear something sensible but strong, that I no longer need every strand in place to feel composed. She removes another invisible pin, one of the last remaining, and places it carefully beside the others. And that, she adds, is a quiet kind of power. You look at the growing collection of pins, glistening with imagined effort. You can almost feel the weight of every style, every hidden meaning, every social cue a woman had to learn, memorize, and carry on her head daily. All that, she says with a sigh. Just to step out the door, she reaches up, now moving slowly, deliberately, and plucks another invisible pin from the base of her bun with the air of someone diffusing a very fussy, powdered bomb. The weight of her hairstyle, real or imagined, seems to lessen with every careful extraction. And now, she says with a calm finality, we come to morning. You shift, sensing the tone change. Yes, she continues, hair had its rules, but morning hair? Morning hair had laws. Mainstream fact, Victorian mourning culture was elaborately codified, particularly under Queen Victoria's reign after the death of Prince Albert. Women were expected to dress and behave a certain way for months or even years, depending on the closeness of the deceased. Hair, of course, was no exception. When someone died, she explains, your entire appearance had to shift. Your clothes went black, your gloves went dull, your jewelry went jet. And your hair? Well, that was where things got delicate. Hair in mourning was expected to be subdued. No elaborate curls, no shiny combs, no flirtatious side parts. Braids were preferred. Low buns, smooth finishes, and definitely no fringe. Heaven forbid. It told the world you were respectable, she says, that you remembered, that you were still walking through grief. You ask how long someone had to wear mourning hair. Depends, she says. A husband? 2 years? A parent? 1? A cousin? Perhaps a month. A goldfish? That was up to the family. You laugh. She does not. Hair, she continues, also became a vessel for memory. Locks were saved, braided, woven. And if you had access to a proper jeweler, turned into mourning rings or pendants, miniature portraits surrounded by a halo of hair. Not just decorative, personal. You ask if people could spot mourning styles on sight. Absolutely, she says. There was a look, the center part. The subdued coil, nothing flashy, no height. Mourning did not rise, it hung. Historians still argue whether these customs provided comfort or simply deepened the weight of social pressure. For many women, however, mourning hair became a kind of emotional shorthand, a visible declaration of loss, pain, and endurance. And we never discussed how difficult it was, she adds. The hours spent re-braiding, the tears soaking into the scalp, the way your arms ached from keeping everything neat while your heart was in pieces. Quirky tidbit. Here it comes. There was a widow in Cornwall who refused to unpin her mourning braid for the entire first year, slept upright in a chair, claimed her grief would unravel if her hair did. You ask if that was common. Not officially, she says, but grief has a way of inventing its own customs. Mourning was meant to signal restraint, but often it became performance. You'd hear whispers. Oh, she's wearing a looped braid. It's only been 6 weeks. Shocking. You picture it. An entire community tracking bun height and braid tightness as a kind of public emotional calendar. And then, she continues, when mourning ended, your hair had to transition. You couldn't just snap back to curls. There were stages, lighter combs, a small ribbon, a looser coil. You re-entered the world slowly, strand by strand. You ask if she ever mourned that way. She nods, quietly. Twice. Once for someone very old, once for someone far too young. You don't press further. I remember unpinning my hair that first day out of mourning, she says, feeling exposed, like I was taking something off. A silence I'd worn for a year. Another pin joins the growing line. It's hard to tell how many remain now. Young women, she adds, sometimes turned morning hair into art. Framed it, hid messages in the braids. One girl embroidered a poem using strands from both her parents. It wasn't beautiful, but it was hers. And there it is again, that odd Victorian mix of restraint and raw feeling. Morning hair wasn't glamorous, but it was sacred. It told a story, she says. It always does. She runs her fingers gently through the air where her bun used to sit, now unpinned and loosening with every breath. Then she looks toward the imaginary window, squinting ever so slightly. Now, let's talk about the real enemy, she says, voice a bit darker, a bit more resigned. You wait, not sure if she means scandal, time, or another duchess with better curls. Pollution, she sighs, the eternal nemesis of a respectable woman's hair. You blink. Like smoke? She turns slowly to face you. Smoke. Soot. Fog, horse dung, coal dust. Pipe ash, factory exhaust, chimney sweep debris. Laundry soot, fire embers, oven grime. London air. Mainstream fact, Victorian cities, especially London, were notoriously polluted. The air was heavy with coal smoke, industrial particulates, and horse waste. For women who often wore their hair in uncovered styles and walked outside frequently, this meant constant exposure to dirt and grime. And the hair, it absorbed everything. You could brush 3 times a day, she says, and still find soot by evening. I've pulled entire embers out of my fringe. Once I smelled roast mutton for 3 days before realizing it was just chimney residue trapped in my braid. She folds her arms. And if you dared wear oil in your hair, congratulations, you're now a walking soot trap. You ask how they dealt with it. Some women wore protective caps, she says. Thin, sheer ones, almost like lace bonnets. Others relied on layers of powder. It didn't prevent pollution, but it disguised it. Briefly, until it rained. Ah yes, the classic London drizzle, nature's unkindest rinse cycle. There was one woman, she says, who swore by lemon vinegar, rinsed her scalp every morning. Her hair turned slightly green. She insisted it was fashionable. We pretended to agree. You ask if rural women had it easier. They did, she admits. Cleaner air, fewer factories, but their hair faced other challenges: smoke from cooking fires, animal grease, wood ash. You see, no woman escapes her environment. The elements always find you, especially if you part your hair in the middle. She pauses, then delivers the quirky tidbit with absolute solemnity. There was a girl in Whitechapel whose hair turned gray at 16, not from age, but from smoke. Her family lived above a blacksmith. She called it her industrial highlight. Historians still argue whether the effects of pollution on personal grooming had a tangible effect on fashion trends. Some believe darker hair became more popular simply because it showed less grime. Others suggest the rise in hats and hairnets wasn't just about modesty, but urban survival. And remember, she adds, public transport was open air. Omnibuses, streetcars, horses, mud. You'd arrive at a party with your hair smelling faintly of cigar and wet cobblestone, and everyone pretended not to notice. You ask about perfume. She nods. We wore it, spritzed onto combs, tucked into sachets. Sometimes applied directly to the roots, but even the finest lavender couldn't compete with the Thames on a foggy day. Then she leans in. The worst, though. Candle soot. The kind that drifts up when the flame gutters. 1 second you're admiring your reflection. Next second, you're seasoning your bangs. You sit in silence, suddenly hyper-aware of how clean your modern life is by comparison. Hair in the city, she says, was a constant negotiation. You could spend hours perfecting your coils, only to emerge from a carriage, looking like you'd been cooked in an oven full of pigeons. She unpins another invisible piece of hair. This one seems to release more than the others. Her posture softens slightly. You learn to adjust, she says, to expect grime, to carry a comb, to brush discreetly in stairwells, and above all, to smile, because a lady does not swat at soot in public, no matter how badly she wants to. She sighs, not heavily, but like someone who's just remembered a story that smells faintly of lye soap and roasted turnips. Of course, she says, shifting ever so slightly. If you lived outside the city, out in the countryside, things were different. Not easier, necessarily. Just differently awful. You raise an eyebrow. Rural hair, she declares, had its own torments. Mainstream fact. Life outside the city offered cleaner air, yes, but with fewer amenities, no salons. No hired maids trained in the precise angle of a crown braid. And certainly no apothecary shelves lined with fashionable scalp treatments. What rural Victorian women lacked in access, they made up for with tough homegrown techniques passed down through generations, and often involving soap that doubled as an insect repellent. You didn't style your hair for aesthetics out there, she says. You styled it so it wouldn't catch fire while making porridge. The styles were simpler. Plaits, tight buns, headscarves. The goal wasn't grandeur, it was practicality. You needed hair that wouldn't fall in the butter churn, or dip into a pail of milk, or tangle in the barn door latch and take a patch of scalp with it. My cousin, she says, once caught her braid on a hook, meant for drying onions. We heard the scream from across the orchard. She wore a lopsided bun for the rest of the season. You try not to smile. Soap was made at home, she continues. Animal fat, lye. Wood ash. Sometimes herbs if you were lucky, nettles if you weren't. The stuff peeled paint. And skin, but it cleaned, mostly. Historians still debate how often rural women washed their hair. Some believe it was once a month. Others argue it was seasonal. There are even recorded traditions where hair was washed only at major life events, weddings, funerals, or harvest festivals. And when it was done, it was done. You boiled water in a kettle, poured it into a basin, then waited for it to stop hissing. Then you braced yourself. She pantomimes the motion, head bent, eyes closed, shoulders hunched like a nervous cat over a porcelain bowl. And if your little brother snuck up and said boo mid-rinse, she adds, well, that's how some families ended up short a milk tooth. Quirky tidbit time, naturally. There was a woman in Dorset who used to wash her hair with rainwater steeped in elderflower. Said it kept her curls soft and her spirits higher than they had any right to be. Her hair was legendary. Her marriage was not. You ask if rural girls ever wore it loose. She snorts. Only if they wanted to be the talk of the hayfield. Loose hair meant vanity, or madness, or ambition. One girl let hers down at a midsummer fair, and 3 boys proposed by nightfall. She ended up with none of them, and a bad cold. She shifts again, pulling another imaginary pin free from the nape of her neck. Her hair, you imagine, now hanging in long, sleepy waves, still heavy with secrets. Rural girls braided before sleep, she says. Tight, so the rats didn't nest in it. Yes, that was a concern. Especially if your attic had thatch. You swallow. Rats? Oh yes, she nods. Hair was warm. And dry. Some unlucky souls woke to discover they'd been nibbled on. After that, we slept with hair tucked and pinned and double-wrapped. You stare at her. She stares back. This is why I don't camp, she adds. You ask if she misses the countryside. Sometimes, she says softly. There's something honest about hair that's tied back because there's wheat to thresh. No vanity. No illusion. just survival. Another pin joins the pile. It clinks, almost audibly in your imagination, like the sound of a long day ending. And yet, she adds with a sigh, even there we wanted to look nice. After the chores were done. After the soot. After the sheep kicked mud at your petticoat, you'd sit down, plait it tight, rub in a little beeswax, and try to remember you were more than your chores. You ask if that was enough. She doesn't answer at first. Then, sometimes you needed a ribbon. She reaches toward the top of her head, now nearly free of its former fortress, and delicately removes a pin you imagine must have been holding everything together. Her expression is softer now, more reflective. We've talked about morning hair, country hair, even polluted hair, she murmurs. But I think you're ready for the most terrifying chapter of all. You brace yourself. Children's hair. You blink. Children's? She nods solemnly. You've never known true difficulty until you've tried to braid the hair of a 5-year-old with the attention span of a garden beetle and the lung capacity of an opera singer. Mainstream fact: Victorian children, especially girls, were held to very specific grooming standards. Their hair was expected to be neat, tidy, and modest. No fancy curls. No wild lengths, no adult styles, and certainly no bangs unless you were still in pinafores. And yet, the expectation of order fell squarely on the shoulders of their caregivers, who often had to wrestle with wriggling, screaming, stubborn little heads. Schoolgirls wore plaits, she says, sometimes single, sometimes in pairs, tied with ribbons. Tight enough to last the day, loose enough not to cause fainting spells. She gives a dry look. There were many fainting spells. You ask what the process was like. Morning combing, she says immediately, a ritual, a battle. A test of nerves. You'd sit the child down on a stool, damp the brush slightly, never too much. Then begin the detangling, and try not to lose your patience or your will to live. She mimes, brushing through thick, invisible tangles. The cries echoed through households. Entire boarding schools rang with the sound of yelping girls and frustrated matrons muttering about improper technique. Quirky tidbit. There was a governess in Surrey who invented a song to sing while brushing. Each verse meant a section of hair. By the time she reached the chorus, the girl's braid was done. The song had 12 verses. No one ever got through them all without weeping. Historians still argue whether these routines were acts of love or control. Some say they instilled discipline and routine. Others point out that the average Victorian child experienced hair maintenance as a mild form of torture, usually administered before breakfast. Sunday was the worst, she says. Church hair had to be perfect. Smoothing cream made from goose grease, frizz tamped with a paste of sugar water and rose petals. If a curl strayed by the second hymn, scandal erupted. One girl once sneezed so hard she uncurled an entire side of her head. The vicar refused to look at her. You ask about boys. They had it easier, she says with a sniff. Short, tidy, and oiled if they were lucky. If not, it stuck out in tufts like a scarecrow. Some were shaved entirely during outbreaks of lice, giving them the tragic look of very short monks. She pauses. But the girls. Oh, the girls. She tells you about schoolroom inspections, where hair was checked for lice, cleanliness, and style uniformity. About the special combs used for tiny heads, often made from ivory or bone. About the jars of camphor and vinegar used liberally, and sometimes cruelly, by panicked aunts. And if a child had curls, she adds, natural curls? You nod. She closes her eyes and whispers, they were envied. Endlessly petted, mercilessly brushed, until they flattened or fought back. You ask if she ever had to style a child's hair. Once, she says. My niece. She had hair like spun copper, and the patience of a caffeinated squirrel. I gave her 3 braids, lost 2 hairpins, and gained a permanent ringing in my ears. You try to imagine what it was like. The small stool, the 2 tight partings, the desperate rush to finish before school bells or visiting hour. And yet, she adds, reaching for another invisible pin, there was something tender about it. Braiding a child's hair meant touching their head with care. It meant preparing them for the world outside the door. Even if that world involved arithmetic and boiled cabbage. She smiles faintly. They didn't understand what it cost us. Our wrists, our tempers, our sanity. But when they turned back at the gate, and their ribbons stayed in place. You felt like you'd done something noble. You ask if children ever did their own hair. She snorts. Only if you were prepared to burn the evidence. The next pin lands gently beside the others, and she leans back just a little. Children's hair, she says, is a test of gentleness, of patience, of love, and of whether you remembered to keep camphor oil in the pantry. By now, the tower atop her head is nearly dismantled. Just a few carefully placed pins remain, and yet she looks more regal than ever, her posture loose, her tone softer. We've covered the weight, she says, the grooming, the grief, the childhood sobbing. But we haven't yet touched the most absurd truth of all. You lean forward. Hair, she whispers, was a trap. Mainstream fact. In Victorian society, a woman's appearance, especially her hair, was closely tied to her eligibility, social standing, and overall virtue. Hair was presented not just as adornment, but as bait. The more carefully it was arranged, the more it could catch something: attention, approval, or a husband. You didn't style your hair to impress yourself, she continues. You styled it to signal, to perform. To be noticed just enough, but never too much. There was a very fine line between elegant and scandalous. You ask how a woman knew which was which. Oh, she says. She didn't, not really. She guessed. She studied portraits. She watched other women. She read etiquette manuals that contradicted each other every season. And it mattered. If a woman was unmarried, her hair had to send a particular message. I am modest, yet fertile, practical, yet decorative, spirited, but only in select lighting. Hairstyle, she adds, was a mating call disguised as a moral code. She tells you about ball preparations. Hours of pinning, puffing, teasing, oiling. A loose tendril at the temple was fashionable, if you were under 23 and engaged. Otherwise, it was considered improper or a sign of illness. Historians still debate whether Victorian women had more or less autonomy in how they styled their hair. But what's certain is that hair was rarely just hair. It was an announcement, a proposition, a subtle advertisement for marriageability and emotional control. There was a girl in Derbyshire, she says, who wore a flower in her braid one evening. Just a little primrose. The next morning she had 2 proposals and 1 anonymous poem nailed to her front door. Quirky tidbit. One woman supposedly dipped her hair in tea to darken it and attract a suitor with a known weakness for brunettes. She misjudged the strength of the blend. It turned orange. He married her anyway. Claimed it reminded him of autumn. You ask if she herself ever styled her hair to catch someone. She gives you a look, then slowly smiles. Once, a specific braid, high crown. A small twist above the left ear. It took me 2 hours and 1 peppermint lozenge to get it right. He noticed. Eventually. You ask what happened. He married someone else. But his sister asked for my recipe for lavender oil, so I count it as a win. She lifts another pin, flicks it free. The lock it once held now imagined to be falling, curling softly against her neck. But the truth is, she says, We all played the game, some more willingly than others. There were girls who changed their entire hairstyle because someone said curls were out of fashion, or because someone else got engaged wearing a low twist, and no one wanted to appear competitive. She describes the invisible etiquette of courting hairstyles. Hair parted down the middle for modesty. Updos for evening functions. Simpler styles for daylight walks. No hairpieces until at least the third picnic. And heaven help you, she adds, if your hair began to thin before you were betrothed. That was practically a death sentence. You ask if she resented it. Sometimes, she says. But mostly I enjoyed the control. We didn't have many ways to shift the odds, but with the right comb, the right oil, and the right hat tilt, you could send a message loud enough to shake the gallery without opening your mouth. She unhooks another pin, watching it disappear into the growing pile. And sometimes, she says, you pinned it high, not to attract, but to deter. A crown braid says, I have no time for nonsense. A knotted chignon says, I have read your letter, and I remain unconvinced. A sharp part? That's a warning. You chuckle. She lets a smile flicker. We used hair the way generals use uniforms, she says, to project strength. Softness, openness, distance. Hair was a battlefield, but sometimes it was also armor. She leans back in her seat now, arms resting loosely in her lap, as if the weight of her hair, real or imagined, has finally lessened enough to breathe freely. Of course, she says, with the trace of a smirk. There were rules, and then there were manuals. You blink. Manuals? Oh yes, she says, eyes twinkling. Books. Pamphlets. Leaflets left at boarding schools. Entire volumes devoted to how a woman should brush, part, coil, scent, secure, display, and, above all, control her hair. Mainstream fact. Victorian etiquette guides were wildly popular and deeply specific. These books dictated the rules of dress, manners, conversation, and yes, hair. Women were instructed not just how to wear it, but when, why, and with what kind of moral intention. There was a right way to wear a bun, a correct time for curls, and an appropriate hour to let one's hair down, figuratively and literally. She lifts an invisible book into her lap and opens it with an exaggerated rustle. Page 1. A lady's hair must always reflect her station. Excessive display invites unwelcome interest. Disorder implies indolence. And fringe, while fashionable, may hint at French sympathies. You raise an eyebrow. Yes, she says dryly. In this house, French sympathies meant scandal, or lace with opinions. She tells you about one infamous etiquette manual, The Dignity of Dress, which warned against diagonal parts, claiming they confused men and unsettled small children. Another advised that hair should never surpass the width of the shoulders, lest it draw attention disproportionate to virtue. You stifle a laugh. She doesn't. This, she says, was how we learned to be women, through books written by men and enforced by aunts. Historians still argue whether women truly followed these rules or simply performed them when necessary. After all, hair can be undone, but a reputation, once frizzed, was harder to smooth. There was a guide for young wives, she continues, that said wearing your hair too high in the first year of marriage was aspirational and unbecoming. It recommended a side bun to indicate humility. And if you were particularly fertile, 2 braids. Symbolism, you see. Quirky tidbit incoming. One lady's journal from 1854 claimed she wore fringe for 3 days just to see if her husband noticed. He did not. But her mother-in-law fainted. Twice. You ask how many of these rules she followed. Oh, most, she admits. At first, I had a comb marked for Sundays, a braid length designated for funerals. Even a special ribbon for cousin visits. But eventually you realize that no matter how many rules you follow, someone will say your curls are too bold. You ask what she did then. I added a flower, she says. Because if they were going to whisper, they might as well have something to talk about. Another invisible pin is lifted and laid to rest. Her imaginary hairstyle now hangs low and soft, like a curtain at the end of a performance. The books tried to make us predictable, she says. But hair doesn't like rules. It bends, it resists. And if you leave it alone long enough, it does whatever it pleases, which in a way makes it the most honest thing we had. She tells you about the hair salons of advice columns, letters from desperate readers asking if they could wear their hair up before noon, or if graying at 30 was a sign of moral failure. There was a letter signed, "Helpless in Huddersfield," asking if it was permissible to wear a single loose curl while in mourning. The columnist replied, "Only if the deceased would have approved." You ask what she thinks of that. "I think the deceased probably had better things to do." She smiles. Another pin drops silently into the pile. The books gave us structure, she admits, but the rebellion was in the details, a looser twist. A skipped ribbon, a part just slightly off-center. Sometimes we followed the rules. And sometimes we didn't. She leans forward slightly now, her hair almost entirely unpinned, falling invisibly in imagined waves against the stiff collar of her gown. There's a new glint in her eye, somewhere between weariness and mischievous pride. "You know," she says, "what they really loved to say back then." You shake your head. That natural beauty, she drawls, was the highest ideal, that a truly refined lady required no artifice, no powder, no hairpieces, no tricks. She lets that hang in the air for a moment before smirking, which of course was absolute rot. Mainstream fact. The Victorian obsession with natural beauty was both culturally pervasive and utterly performative. Women were constantly praised for looking fresh and unadorned, but doing so required hours of preparation. The goal wasn't to actually be natural, it was to appear as though no effort had been made, all while deploying every tool in the arsenic-scented arsenal of beauty maintenance. Looking natural, she says, meant achieving an impossibly specific kind of perfection. Your hair had to shine, but not too much, curl, but not artificially, smell faintly of flowers, but not of perfume. And above all, it had to look effortless, as if you'd just awakened from a dream and happened to resemble a painting. She raises an invisible strand and studies it theatrically. I once spent 3 hours recreating a look described in a magazine as casually tousled. It required 2 maids, 1 curler, 4 hairpins, and a lemon. You ask where the lemon came in. Acidity, she says, to set the wave, or to remove the memory of failure. You ask if people really believed others woke up that well-coiffed. Some did, she says. Most of us knew better, but we all played along. Complimented the natural curl, pretended not to notice the faint line of powder at the hairline. If someone had a suspiciously symmetrical ringlet pattern, we'd say she was blessed, not wired. Historians still debate whether the Victorian beauty ideal was more oppressive than that of earlier eras, but what's undeniable is how deeply ingrained it became. No artifice was the lie everyone agreed to uphold, especially women who wielded subtle skill like a silent rebellion. Quirky tidbit, she's ready. There was a woman in Bath who claimed she'd never altered her hair in her life. Said it fell into place naturally, like a divine whisper. It later emerged she owned 27 switches, 3 hot combs, and a live-in maid named Grace, who hadn't slept in 4 years. You laugh. She does not. Poor Grace, she adds. You ask how she felt pretending to be effortless, tired, she says simply, and annoyed. But also a little proud, because it was an art. Making something look effortless takes more effort than anyone admits. She describes a scene, her as a younger woman, standing before the mirror with her maid, adjusting, smoothing, brushing back a lock that refused to stay tucked. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. One raised eyebrow. One breath held, and the look was perfect. Then, she adds, I walked into the drawing room and was told I looked so natural, like I hadn't tried at all. You ask how she responded. I thanked them, she says, and resisted the urge to remove a pin and toss it like a dart. Another pin drops into the silent pile. Only a few remain now. We all played the part, she says, pretending not to know what it took to meet the illusion, to look almost like ourselves, but better. Softer, lovelier, as if by accident. She glances toward the imagined mirror once more. I think we believed that if we performed the illusion long enough, we'd become it. She sits a little straighter now, even as her once imagined updo is nearly undone. You can sense a shift, a hint of steel beneath the silk, as if you've wandered into the part of the story she rarely tells. Of course, she says softly. None of this mattered much if you couldn't leave the house with it. You raise an eyebrow. She nods. I mean travel. Specifically, traveling with hair. Mainstream fact. Victorian travel was not designed with the delicate needs of elaborate hairstyles in mind. Between steam trains, stagecoaches, steamboats, and carriage rides, hair was constantly at war with wind, soot, jostling, and unexpected humidity. And women, expected to arrive somewhere looking fresh and composed, developed intricate, often ridiculous systems for protecting their styles in transit. You had to plan, she says. Not just for the journey, but for your hair's experience of the journey. That meant combs packed in velvet wraps, spare ribbons, scented sachets, a collapsible mirror, and most importantly, the bonnet box. She gestures toward an invisible container beside her. My bonnet box was the size of a cannonball crate and twice as temperamental. It held my emergency hairpieces, my reserve combs, and one very judgmental lavender pomade that melted if looked at wrong. You ask how long it took to pack. 3 hours, she says. Minimum, and that's assuming you weren't traveling in summer when heat could uncurl everything by the 3rd mile. She tells you about train travel. The windows were always slightly ajar. The soot would find you, always. I once stepped off a train in full morning black and discovered a fine stripe of ash across my parting. It looked like I'd been struck by a theatrical bolt of lightning. Historians note that Victorian travel was often exhausting, uncomfortable, and utterly unkind to the well-coiffed. But women were expected to arrive as though nothing had happened. Hence, elaborate protective hairstyles, temporary bonnets, traveling veils, and in some cases, complete travel wigs. There was a woman, she says, who kept a separate wig just for the journey. Called it her railway hair, slightly flattened, soot-resistant, smelled faintly of cloves and resignation. Quirky tidbit. Naturally. One lady swore by wrapping her hair in thin linen soaked in bay rum before travel, said it preserved the shape. It also preserved the smell of pickled pastries, but she was committed. You ask if she ever lost a hairpiece en route. Once, she says gravely, carriage hit a pothole. My side ringlet flew out the window and landed on a constable's boot. He returned it, said nothing. We never spoke again. You ask what the worst hair-related travel disaster she witnessed was. She doesn't blink. I once saw a woman's entire chignon unravel during a sea crossing. The wind caught it, lifted it like a banner, and then draped it across the face of a retired colonel. He said he'd seen less chaos at Balaclava. You try not to choke on your laughter. But it wasn't always funny, she adds. Sometimes it was humiliating, arriving flustered, hair lopsided, ribbons soaked, pins lost, and still expected to be charming, composed, and ready for polite conversation. Another pin is removed with care. Her hair, now almost entirely freed, seems to hover around her like memory made visible. And still, she says, we packed our brushes, tucked pomade tins into reticules, practiced braids that could survive turbulence. Because we weren't just traveling, we were appearing. You ask if it was worth the effort. She looks at the floor for a moment, then smiles, sometimes, when the light hit right. When your curls held. When someone said, "You look just as you did at breakfast," and they meant it as a compliment, not a concern. She sets down the pin. And sometimes, she adds, you just wore a hat and lied. She sits with her hands resting gently in her lap, now entirely liberated from the invisible scaffolding of pins and padding that held her Victorian hairstyle aloft. But her voice remains as crisp as ever, clear, unwavering, as though recounting battle strategies rather than buns. We've talked about London, about carriages, about bonnet boxes and corseted despair, but what about when you left England entirely? You tilt your head, and she answers the question before you ask it. The colonies, she says. That's where hairstyles went to die. Mainstream fact. British women travelling to or living in colonial territories during the Victorian period faced an entirely different climate, both literally and socially. Hair that had been carefully arranged for English weather and English eyes quickly wilted under tropical heat, monsoons, or the bone-dry air of colonial outposts. The result? Improvised methods, local influences, and plenty of quietly stifled frustration. You'd spend 5 hours perfecting your braids, she says. Step off the boat in Bombay or Kingston, and within 20 minutes, you looked like a drowned governess with a powder allergy. Humidity was the worst culprit, she explains. It undid curls like treachery, lifted buns, slackened pins, turned pomade to soup. The only thing it didn't undo was your sense of obligation to look decent while melting into your petticoat. She describes an afternoon in Calcutta, where she watched a woman's carefully crimped fringe turn to steam in real time. By tea, it had fused into a single curl that hung like a question mark over her left eyebrow. She carried on, bless her, even smiled. You ask if any solutions existed. Oh, we tried, she says. Silk scarves, lighter oils, local herbs. We consulted with native stylists, though of course we did so without admitting we were utterly lost. One woman swore by coconut oil. Another soaked her pins in rosewater overnight. Someone even tried beeswax mixed with quinine. I don't recommend it. Historians note that British women abroad often adopted subtler versions of local practices, though never openly. There was both fascination and fear, an unspoken pressure to maintain British propriety while facing climates that cared not one whit for English etiquette. Of course, she adds, we never talked about the envy. You blink. The native women, she says quietly. Their hair, thick, glossy, perfectly plaited in the heat. We pretended we pitied them for not wearing bonnets, but really, we were furious. They moved like silk while we wilted. She admits to once copying a braid she saw worn by a local market girl. It stayed perfect for 2 full days, she says, eyes wide. Then I overheard someone call it unorthodox and immediately wrapped it in lace and regret. Quirky tidbit, of course. There was a lieutenant's wife in Cairo who had a custom net made of camel hair to protect her curls from desert wind. She claimed it was invisible. It was not. She looked like a particularly judgmental lampshade. You ask if anything worked reliably. Short hair, she says flatly. But that was unthinkable. She tells you about travel parties returning home, hairline sun-faded, split ends waving like flags of surrender. One woman came back with braids so frayed they had to be trimmed with embroidery scissors before customs would let her through. Another pin joins the others. She doesn't even watch it fall. You learn quickly in the colonies, she says, that your hair does not care about your social aspirations. It has its own loyalties, to sweat, to salt air, to wind, to gravity. You ask what she learned from that. She smiles. To laugh, she says. To expect failure, to carry extra pins, and to stop apologizing when your chignon uncoils in the middle of a dinner toast. Her hands hover near her temple now, where only a few stubborn pins remain, holding nothing, really, except old muscle memory and a trace of theatrical pride. She exhales gently, a sound that feels like the end of a performance. Now, she says, let me tell you about the day everything changed. You perk up. 1 minute your hairstyle was the pinnacle of taste. The next it was archaic, ancient. Mocked by children and abandoned by your hairdresser in favor of something new, something scandalous, something French. Mainstream fact. Victorian fashion was not immune to trends, and hairstyles were no exception. Major changes could come quickly, sparked by a royal portrait, an international fad, a new product, or even illness. One famous example: when Empress Eugénie of France popularized the low, sleek chignon in the 1850s, British women scrambled to mimic it, leaving older, fussier styles behind almost overnight. It always started with a portrait, she says. A lady of status, a royal, someone important enough to sit for an artist who didn't hate her. The painting would be unveiled, and within the month, every woman with a mirror would be trying to imitate the shape of that bun. She lowers her voice dramatically. And then came the reactions. You ask what that meant. The older women would sneer, the clergyman would sigh, and someone at a tea party would say, "Well, I still find a high twist to be more dignified," which of course meant she couldn't pull off the new style. She chuckles faintly. I myself wore a parted fringe with a coiled crown braid for 7 years, until a cough epidemic swept through the city. Suddenly, high styles were out, seen as too austere, too funereal, and down came the hair. You raise an eyebrow. Wait. Illness changed fashion? Oh yes, she says. A bout of illness or death in the royal family could send shockwaves through salons. Everyone switched to morning curls. Soft. Downward. Reflective. As though your scalp, too, were grieving. Historians still argue whether hairstyles were truly dictated by such events, or simply used them as convenient excuses to follow more comfortable trends. But there's ample evidence that even middle-class women altered their grooming rituals in response to public mourning or court fashion shifts. Then came the beauty columns, she continues, praising the new naturalism, as if we hadn't just spent decades pinning ourselves into coiffures shaped like cathedral domes. She tells you about a cousin who refused to adopt the new low-bun trend. She held out until 1867, said her neck looked undecorated without height. One day she attended a wedding and realized she was the only one. The next morning she had her hair cut and sent the locks to a wig maker out of spite. Quirky tidbit? Absolutely. There was a woman in Bristol, she says, who resisted every trend until her dog walked into the drawing room wearing a fringe ribbon. She claimed the humiliation was too great. The next week she bought a crimping iron. You ask how she coped with these sudden shifts. At first I resisted, she admits. I thought, why should my hair move just because Paris does? But then I saw how easy the new style looked, how light, and how it made me feel almost like a different person. She smiles gently. Hair is like a hemline. It moves with the world. You ask if that was difficult to accept. It was liberating, she says. Once you stop thinking of your hair as a sculpture and start seeing it as a conversation, you become free to change. She reaches up and removes the second-to-last imaginary pin. The room feels quieter somehow. One day you're sculpting ringlets with a sugar water glaze, she says. The next, you're smoothing a simple knot behind the ear. And instead of mourning the loss, you feel lighter. You ask if she ever regretted letting go of the old styles. Sometimes, she admits, but mostly I was grateful. Grateful to be reminded that no matter how carefully we build ourselves, it's still possible to take it all down and begin again. There's only one pin left. You can feel it, hanging somewhere near her temple, holding nothing but habit. She pauses, fingers just above it, as if giving it a moment of silence. Then, in a voice so soft it barely disturbs the air, she says, "And of course, the men had opinions. You weren't expecting that." "Oh, don't look surprised," she says, arching an invisible brow. "They always did." Whether they voiced them or not, and they always insisted it didn't matter. Wear your hair how you like, my dear, while quietly recoiling at anything that didn't resemble their mother. Mainstream fact, Victorian men did have plenty of documented opinions about women's hair, even if they rarely admitted it. In literature, private correspondence, and etiquette manuals for young husbands, hair was often referenced as a woman's crown, something symbolic of purity, refinement, modesty, or, depending on the author, her moral decay. They wrote poems about it, she continues, endless poems, golden tresses, ebony waves, a single curl upon a cheek like the moonlight on velvet. I married a man who once compared my hair to a forest floor. I'm still unsure whether it was a compliment. You ask what men liked best. They liked predictability, she says. Hair parted just so. Tidy, low, symbolic of patience. And length, always length, even if they couldn't say exactly why. There was something about long hair that made them feel as though you had enough time and discipline to grow it. Historians still debate whether Victorian men genuinely understood the time and labor involved in maintaining the elaborate hairstyles they so often praised in prose. But one thing is clear. Women's hair was judged, noticed, and very often misunderstood. I once let my hair down at home, she says. It was hot, I was tired, and my husband looked at me like I'd sprouted antlers. You chuckle. She doesn't. He said it was alarming. I said it was honest. We did not discuss it again. She tells you about public reactions too. The way men commented in newspapers, wrote letters to editors, complained about modern styles as if loose buns and side parts signaled the decline of society. Quirky tidbit, she says, reading your mind. There was a bishop who delivered an entire sermon on the spiritual distraction of elaborate chignons. Said they led to daydreams, discontent, and possibly elbow exposure. You laugh out loud. It was a slow news week, she says with a wry smile. But not all opinions were spoken aloud. Some were subtler. A pause, a longer glance, a remark that a lady looked softer with curls or more composed without fringe. Entire marriages lived and died on such phrases. I learned to listen, she says, to read the pauses, to note the way a compliment felt just a bit too rehearsed. You ask if that changed her hair choices. Sometimes, she says. At first. Then I realized I didn't want to wear hair for admiration. I wanted to wear it for command. You raise an eyebrow. Oh, yes, she says. A tight crown braid in court says, I'm not here to entertain you. A polished side roll at dinner says, I know who's lying about the wine cellar. A swept-back twist in the parlor? That's a warning shot. Historians often overlook the subtle power of hair as social armor, but Victorian women understood it. They used it not only to attract or impress, but to communicate, protect, and sometimes even intimidate. Men said they preferred simplicity, she says, but they noticed the complexity, and whether they liked it or not, they respected it. She finally reaches for the last pin. It's small, delicate, almost ceremonial. And sometimes, she adds, if a woman let her hair down in front of a man, it meant trust, not seduction, not weakness. Just the end of performance. The pin drops softly. She exhales. And for the first time tonight, you imagine her hair not as armor or artifice, but simply hair. Not every man understood, she says, but the ones who did, they never commented on the style, only on the effort, and the way it caught the light when you weren't trying. Her hands rest quietly now. No more invisible pins to pluck. No more imagined weight balanced delicately atop her head. She looks lighter. Not younger exactly, but loosened, the way a willow sways once the storm has passed. Of course, she says gently, all hair comes to an end eventually. You pause, unsure whether she means metaphorically or biologically. She clarifies, I mean hair loss. Mainstream fact. Victorian women, for all their grooming and protective rituals, were not immune to the very natural process of hair thinning, graying, and balding. In fact, many hair tonics of the time, sold under grand, poetic names like Mrs. Allen's World Hair Restorer or Dr. Barry's Trichophorus, were aimed at women desperate to slow the inevitable retreat of their hairlines. You could lose it to illness, she says, to age, to stress, to childbirth, to too tight plaits and too many nights sleeping in curl rags. Sometimes it just gave up. And when it did, you didn't talk about it. You whispered about it. In closets, behind fans, like a scandal. She describes one poor woman who refused to turn her head too quickly in public after a patch of scalp began showing above her temple. She developed a habit of nodding instead of turning, she says. By the end of the season, people thought she'd developed a nervous condition. You ask if there were solutions. Oh, dozens, she replies. Mostly lies. Some dangerous. There were tonics with alcohol, ammonia, even mercury. Some claimed to grow your hair overnight. Others just burned your scalp and ruined your pillows. Historians still argue whether these remedies were placebo or poison. Some formulas may have temporarily stimulated follicles, but most simply capitalized on a quiet panic shared by women across classes. Quirky tidbit. Here it comes. There was a woman in Sussex who swore her hair regrew because she slept every night with a slice of potato under her cap. She said the starch gave her strength. I say, she gave her maid night terrors. You ask if she herself ever used one of these remedies. Oh yes, she says. An elderflower tonic from a woman with hands that smelled of soot and honey. I paid her a shilling. My scalp tingled for days. Nothing grew. But for 1 week, I believed it might. She explains that when all else failed, women turned to hairpieces, subtle ones known as rats, made from their own previously brushed out hair, collected lovingly in little pouches called hair receivers. Yes, she confirms. We made cushions from our lost hair, then pinned the rest of our hair over it to hide the fact that we were losing hair. You blink. She nods. There's poetry in it, really. You lose part of yourself, and then you build upon it. As the years passed, she says, her hair thinned. The curls grew lazy. The texture changed. She stopped fighting it. There was a day I woke up, looked in the mirror, and said, no more pomade, no more pins. No more chasing yesterday's shape, and it felt like stepping off a stage. You ask if she missed it. Some days, she says, but mostly I found relief. Because there's something beautiful about letting the curtain fall, about saying, this is the hair I have, this is the face I wear. Let it be. She leans her head slightly, as if testing the freedom of a world with no scaffolding. People said I looked tired. Others said I looked wise. One gentleman said I looked honest. That one I liked. You ask what she tells women now. To let go gracefully, she says. To honor the seasons, and to stop measuring themselves by what remains on their heads. She smiles. We built empires out of braids and kingdoms out of curls. But we were never the sum of our hairstyles, just the ones who wore them best, until we didn't. The room feels quieter now, as though even the air is tiptoeing toward rest. Her hands rest idly on her lap, hair, imagined or otherwise, fully loosed. The performance is over, but the story, not quite. Of course, she says, almost wistfully, there was one thing we never threw away. You look at her. She gives a knowing smile. The hair itself. Mainstream fact. In Victorian times, it was common, especially among the middle and upper classes, to keep hair. Not just in hairbrushes or forgotten pins, but preserved, treasured, and turned into keepsakes. Hair was woven into jewelry, sewn into brooches, curled into lockets, framed in wall art, and even crafted into intricate family trees, literal, braided genealogies of the dearly departed. I had a bracelet, she says, slowly. A cuff of woven chestnut strands, my sister's, worn soft with time, the ends sealed in tiny gold caps. I wore it for 10 years after she passed. Every time I twisted my wrist, I remembered the way she rolled her eyes when she braided her fringe too tight. You ask if it was common. Oh yes, she says. Hair was eternal. Long after breath had left the body, the hair remained. It didn't rot, didn't fade. It was something tangible to mourn, to hold. Historians confirm that Victorian mourning culture revolved around preservation, of clothing, of letters, and especially of hair. It was a silent language of grief. Hair from lovers, children, parents, all tucked into rings, hidden in cabinets, or displayed with reverent pride. I knew a woman, she says, who had a mourning necklace with strands from all 5 of her siblings, each woven into a tiny twist along the chain. It wasn't macabre. It was anchoring, like carrying voices around your throat. Quirky tidbit? She doesn't disappoint. There was a gentleman in Yorkshire who had his wife's hair made into a watch chain. Then he added a bit of his mother's, and a beloved horse's tail hair. By the end, the chain was so thick he couldn't wear it, but he kept it on a hook, called it the timeline. You ask if she still has any pieces. She nods slowly. A brooch, oval, tortoiseshell frame. Inside, a coiled lock from my mother. Dark, slightly wiry, stubborn as ever. I look at it some mornings and remember the way she'd swat my hands away from her pins. Not yet, she'd say. You're not ready to learn that braid. She pauses. And when she passed, I found a little envelope tucked in her dresser. My hair, from my first haircut. Labeled in her hand, 2 inches, already defiant. You smile. She doesn't cry. She just breathes. There's something comforting about this idea that hair could outlast quarrels and silence, oceans and funerals, that it could be kept, like a secret folded into a drawer. You ask if it ever felt strange, holding on to something so personal from someone gone. It felt right, she says, because hair is history. Every strand is a thread back to a moment, a brush, a comb, a glance. The things we couldn't keep in words, we kept in curls. She glances at the imaginary pile of pins beside her. We spend so long building our crowns, she murmurs. But in the end, the things that remain are smaller, softer, a lock in a box, a braid in a locket, A few silver strands in an old hair receiver no one dares throw away. And then, as if letting a curtain drop, she smiles. But don't be sad. We were never just our hair. We were the hands that wove it, the voices that whispered while brushing it. The laughter shared over crooked parts and scorched curls. She closes her eyes for a moment. And in the quiet, you'll remember that. The silence that follows is almost sacred, not heavy, not mournful, just soft, like fabric draped over furniture at the end of a long visit. She sits still, her hair now entirely unbound, the last of the pins forgotten, and her voice, when it returns, is the gentlest it's been all night. "There's one last thing," she says, "something no etiquette book, no beauty manual, no snide society column ever told you about hair. You wait." It marked time, mainstream fact. In the Victorian world, hair was not just an aesthetic concern or a social signifier. It was a quiet, ever-present calendar. You could trace a woman's life by the shape and style of her hair. Child, maiden, wife, widow. Plaited hair meant schoolgirl. A sleek, center-parted bun meant maturity. A sudden streak of silver, a looser coil, a widow's veil over parted hair, all silent indications of passing years. She clasps her hands softly. When I was 6, I wore a braid tied with a blue ribbon. When I was 16, that braid became 2. When I was 20, I twisted them up and pinned them high for my engagement dinner. When I was 29, I let them down after a funeral. You don't speak. You let her keep going. I cut them short once, she adds. After the birth of my second child. Not fashionable, not flattering, but practical. I was so tired. And when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. But I didn't mind, because I knew the hair would grow back. And so would I. Historians still argue whether such subtle shifts in appearance were conscious markers of change or simply practical adjustments. But many diaries, letters, and portraits show clear evolution. Grief marked in loosened styles, joy in tighter curls, rebellion in fringe. Hair was how we marked the seasons, she says. Not just in fashion, but in feeling, in memory. Quirky tidbit, this one is quieter. I once braided my daughter's hair every morning for 5 years, she says. Even when she was cross, even when she had lice, even when I was angry. It was how we made peace. Through the comb, through the motion, through the rhythm. She looks off to the side for a long moment, then back. Time passed, and one day she braided my hair. It was lopsided and she used far too many ribbons. But I let her, because time had passed and she was ready to hold the thread. You ask what her hair looks like now. She smiles gently. It's thinner, softer, the color of candle ash. But it's mine, and some mornings I still pin it up, not for a party or a suitor or even a mirror, just because I can. Just to remember the weight. The room, now completely still, feels less like a space and more like a held breath. She rises slowly, as if her body were made of story. Her reflection, not in a mirror but in your imagination, feels ageless. Timeless, not because her hair is styled, but because it no longer needs to be. You asked, she says, why you'd regret asking a Victorian woman how she did her hair. She walks past, trailing memory like perfume. It's not because it's a long story, she adds, just before fading. It's because I'll tell you all of it. And now, as her footsteps fade into silence and the last pin clinks to rest, you feel your own breathing slow. There's no need to hold up the scene anymore. No need to imagine the weight of 27 pins, the tug of a too-tight plait, or the whisper of satin ribbons sliding into place. Let it all unravel now, gently, like an old braid loosened strand by strand. You are no longer in the parlor, no longer watching her gestures, or hearing the laughter behind her sighs. Instead, you're drifting, quietly, warmly, through the echo of her memories. You carry her hairpins now, not in your hand, but in your thoughts, light and harmless. Like tiny anchors to the past, you think of your own hair, how you've cut it, grown it, fussed with it, let it fall flat when no one was watching. And maybe, just maybe, you smile at the idea that even a single strand could carry so many stories. The room around you fades gently, the edges blur, the colors soften. All that remains is the sound of your breath and the comfortable hush that follows the end of a long, curious tale. And just as your eyelids begin to fall, you hear her voice one last time, so faint you can't quite tell whether it's in the room or just a pleasant shape in your dreams. "Sleep well," she whispers. "You've earned it. Sweet dreams."